Ready? I hope when I get a few more years on me, I can still sing that well. Thank you, Gary, for leading the worship for me this morning, and Dana for playing. We'll look at the announcements real quick. The Flock and Livewire are meeting today at their respective times. Brother Dave will be in Hibernia Christian Church tonight at 7 o'clock. If you'd like to go over for that, he'll be preaching for their first revival service. This week we get things back on track. We had a good revival last week. We'll have handbells on Tuesday night. We'll have choir practice and Bible studies on Wednesday night and Thursday mornings. You are cordially invited to the wedding of Jamie Collins and Brandon Beverly. It will be held Saturday, October the 10th at 4:30 at Scottsburg United Methodist Church. Everyone is invited to attend. The Flock has pumpkin painting here on Friday, October 16th from 5 to 7. They'll be serving pizza, chips, and pop. Wear your old clothes and bring your friends. We need donations of 20 to 25 pumpkins, any size, starting next week. We'll celebrate with our fall sharing at the residence of Hampton Oaks and Point Lake Village on October the 18th. Also, October the 18th is Pastor Appreciation Day. That's your opportunity to show Dave how much you appreciate him. Are there any other announcements that we have this morning? All right, at this time, if the children would like to go to Children's Church, please do so. You know, Mike Talk was talking about fantasy football, and occasionally I'm asked if I like sports. I do. I don't care anything for basketball or football or celebrity bowling. I do, however, like to hunt and I like to fish. One of the reasons that I think I like to fish is because all fishing is fantasy. You know, if you hook one and it gets away, it weighed at least 10 pounds. Nobody can argue. You can join a bass club knowing that 50% of the people in there are liars and that the other 50% of the people don't care. It reminds me of a story of a pastor who moved from Tennessee to Colorado, partially because he felt the Lord's call, but partially because he was a big hunter. Wanted to hunt something besides the stuff he could hunt in Tennessee. Well, as things worked out, he shot a condor. Now, a condor is in the endangered list, and he got caught. So as he stood before the judge said, you know, why in the world did you do that? The pastor said, well, Judge, he said, you know, I'm not from around here. Where I come from, you can shoot almost anything. And he said, I've got 6 kids and a wife at home to feed. And that condor went a long way. Well, the judge, he fiddled and fussed for a moment. He thought, well, the old boy is new, and he probably didn't know. He said, okay, friend, he said, I'm going to let you off with just a warning. But just out of curiosity, how was the condor? He said, well, it wasn't bad, but it wasn't near as good as that bald eagle. Dave says you ought to go tell jokes at the beginning, so it's his fault. How deep is your pit this morning without hope? I could have just as easily titled it Survival 101, because all of us at some point in time are going to be in a pit. Maybe you're in one right now, or maybe you see one coming. Maybe you still remember the last one. The Bible is full of characters who are in pits. Joseph was thrown in a pit by his brothers because he was a dreamer and because they were rotten brothers. They went over and sat down and ate, pondering whether and how they were going to kill him when a band came by and they decided to sell him into slavery. His pit was brought onto him by his own loved ones. There's a story of David, trapped and lonely and fearful for his life. He's being chased and pursued on all sides by his enemies. In this cave, he knows there will be no captives. If he's caught, he will die. I want to tell you a remarkable story this morning, one that most of us will remember. It was the story of 33 miners that were trapped below the earth's surface. Now, I confess to you, I'm not going to try to pronounce their names because they're from Chile. I have enough trouble speaking English. Rebecca Hammond comes and stays with us occasionally when she comes back to the States. First time I met her, she was diligently studying Spanish. She said, "Do you know any Spanish words?" I said, "Taco Bell." She said, "You're half right." George was a veteran miner of the San Jose mine in Chile, in the Atacama Desert. They were working 2,000 feet below the earth's surface when he saw something he thought was a butterfly. His co-worker Franklin said, "No, it's not a butterfly. It's a rock. It's translucent, it's milky, and it's quartz, and it glimmers like a butterfly when the light catches it." But it was also a warning, because as they drove not more than 60 feet from the spot where they had seen the rock, there was a massive explosion, and the area around them filled with dust. Unknown to them, but it was part of an incredible collapse that went through the entire mine. Those two men, along with 31 others, were about to undergo an ordeal like few people ever suffer, and even less people ever survive. The collapse of the San Jose mine occurred August the 5th of 2010. It became international news as 33 men were trapped underground for 69 days. They were going to battle starvation and hopelessness as the world awaited to hear news of 33 men trapped in a mine. The San Jose mine was more than 100 years old, and a century of digging and blasting can worn out all the internal structure. The mine was known for primitive working conditions and perfunctory safety practices. It had escape tunnels, however, they were useless. They had no ladders. On the afternoon of the 5th, the miners heard the explosion. They were enveloped in the dust, and the ramps leading to the surface were gone. It sounded like a massive skyscraper crashing in behind them, one miner said. The names of the 33 miners were painted on a rock at the camp where their relatives waited to hear news of a rescue. That day, a single block of diorite as tall as the Empire State Building had broken off from the rest of the mountain, and it was falling through the layers of the mine. It caused a chain reaction in the mountain, and most of the mountain collapsed too. The piece of the stone that the men saw, they would find out later, was 550 feet tall. It weighed 770,000 pounds. It was twice the weight of the Empire State Building. In the ensuing quake, several men were knocked off their feet by the blast. The walls began to shake. Rocks the size of oranges were falling all around them. A quick inspection showed that they'd been cut off from the surface. There was no electricity. There was no intercom system. There was no flow of water. There was no compressed air. The men, not knowing the cause or the extent of the devastation, didn't know whether they'd be rescued in a few hours or a few days. They retreated to the refuge, which is a classroom-size, steel-reinforced room that holds provisions, enough for 25 men for 2 days. The inventory of food included 1 can of salmon, 1 can of peaches, 1 can of peas, 18 cans of tuna, 24 liters of condensed milk, 8 of which had already expired, 93 packages of cookies, and some expired medicines. They had a mere 10 bottles of water. Although there were thousands of liters keeping the engines and machinery cool, while it was dirty and oily and occasionally used for bathing, it was drinkable, and they drank it. In order to ration food, the miners would eat 1 scoop of tuna fish and 2 cookies once a day at noon. Food rationing, they learned, would soon become much harder. If a man eats 1 or 2 cookies and a spoonful of tuna each day, the provisions might stretch for a week. A miner named Mario, one of the leaders throughout the ordeal, would line up 33 plastic cups. He would take a teaspoon of canned fish. He'd put it in each cup. In that cup, he would pour some water, making a broth. Then he passed out 2 cookies to each man. "Enjoy your meal," he said. "This is delicious stuff. Make it last." The single meal at noon was almost exactly 300 calories, and it was meant to hold them until noon the next day. They'll soon broaden their menu to include soup that they'll cook using the industrial water. They'll cook it in the air filter of one of the trucks. They'll put in a single can of tuna with no salt, very few peas, but plenty of motor oil for flavoring. In time, the rumbling of their collective stomachs will grow so loud that it will echo through the mine. Some will mistake that sound for the mine collapsing again. Most of the men sleep in the refuge. After several days, the fetid scent began to gather and cook. It transformed the air into a stew of body odor. In that portion of the world, at 2,200 feet in the middle of the desert, the temperature in that cave is 94 degrees, with a relative humidity of 95%. Constant. The walls leak, everything's sticky, everything's damp. One of the miners said later, "I've smelled corpses before, and for a while, it smelled worse than that." As days passed, a society developed. The men began to hold prayer meetings. They played checkers made on homemade checkerboards, dominoes made on homemade domino boards. They occasionally think they're hearing drilling, but no rescue appears. Sometimes their humor turns dark. One of the miners tells the only Bolivian in the group, "You better hope they come for us soon, because if you don't, since you're the only Bolivian, we'll probably eat you first." They had no idea how long they would be underground, and they entertained the idea of cannibalism. Some men didn't appreciate the jokes, some did. Some workers finally drilled a small hole from the top, and after 17 days, they had hope, but their ordeal was far from over. Above ground, meanwhile, several potential rescuers descended 2.5 miles. They went into the mine, but they were only stopped by the giant monolith. Seeing it, one of the veteran miners wept, fearing he would never see his colleagues again. Officials also discovered that this building-sized slab was still shifting, making a new collapse possible any day. Miners and drilling experts sought to figure out how they could drill without collapsing the already weakened mountain. In time, drilling experts from around the world would join the effort. Outside the mine entrance, the mine family set up a camp, calling it Camp Hope. There they could stay, awaiting word of rescue, and to be sure that they kept pressure on the government officials. Camp Hope was site for more than 2,000 family members, workers, and press. Their story quickly became global, and the Las Vegas odds set their chances of survival at less than 2%. After 2 weeks under the ground, many of the miners were having trouble walking. Their ribs began to stick through their skin. The sound of daily drilling was now unmistakable, but the miners had no idea how long it would take. They would eventually hear over a dozen drills fail to hit their target. Disappointments began to feel like second deaths. By now, there was just enough food to give each man one cookie every other day. In time, they stretched that out to 3 days to make the food last longer. At one point, a single slice of peach about the size of your thumb was found in the corner. It was meticulously divided into 33 pieces about the size of a fingernail. Another time, the men experienced temporary blindness, the first signs and common side effects of hunger and lack of vitamin A. On the 17th day, the drill that had been growing louder suddenly stopped. The sound was replaced by whistling wind. One of the drills had broken through. The miners ran to see, and they began to furiously pound on it with wrenches. They were like little kids hitting a piñata. The men began laughing and cheering. They celebrated by passing around a plastic bottle filled with dirty water as though it were champagne. They tied notes to the bit, informing those on the surface that all 33 men were still alive. After 17 days, the men finally had hope. But the end of their ordeal was far, far away. As food and clean water and a phone and other supplies were passed down through a 4.5-inch hole, the men's joy were dashed when they learned that getting them to the surface, including finding a way to bring them up that wouldn't risk the collapse of the mine, could take as long as 4 months. While the men managed to support each other during the times of dire starvation, there was greater danger. Healthy men dealing with this collective frustration. Confrontations grew. Everyone was heated. Everyone was angered. With the fortune in their hands of mystery people above, one miner wrote, "Now I know how animals feel in captivity, always depending on someone else to feed them." Hope was hard to come by. It was even harder to sustain. Their well-being quickly became primary concern for their rescuers. You see, psychologically, you have to have 3 things to survive. You have to have someone to love, you have to have something to do, and you have to have something to hope for. Really, the miners only had these 3 things. And their thoughts and their efforts would revolve around those. Today, we're not so far removed from the miners in our daily lives. Most of us have someone to love. We have something to do. We have some small measure of hope. The miners had their families and their loved ones. They had something to do. They cared for one another. They sang songs. They prayed fervently throughout the day. And above all, they tried to encourage one another with hope. Some of them placed their family and their hope in their family. One miner said his father was a retired miner and he would dig him out by hand if he had to. We trust our loved ones with our hearts and our hope. Some placed their hope in the company. By this time, 3 countries had sent men and equipment to help free the miners. Some of the miners spent their days looking for other ways out. In their heart, they all knew the only real hope they had was in God. For 69 days, they were at death's door. Because any time during that 69 days, the rest of the mine could have collapsed. How deep is your pit today? Is it dark? Is it lonely like theirs? Is it a pit of worldly pleasure? Is it a pit of greed? Is your pit filled with drugs? Is it full of bad relations? Jesus pulled many people from the pit of despair. He healed the blind from the pit of darkness. He healed the lame from the pit of immobility. He cast out demons and released them from their nightmarish pits. He pulled people from the pits of death. You see, the devil tells us that in this life, that's all there is. No afterlife, no judgment, no hope of spending eternity with God. And you see, he banks on the choices we make and on the decisions we make. 1 Peter 1:21, through him you believed in God, who raised him from the dead and glorified him. And so your faith and your hope are in God. If we listen to that lie, we doom ourselves to the eternal pit, the one prepared for the lost. In Jesus we have hope, but we must choose and make the right decision. Hebrews 2, verse 1, so we must listen very carefully to the truth. We have heard it, and we do not want to drift away from it. For the message God delivered through his angels has always stood firm, and every violation of the law and every act of disobedience was punished. So what makes us think we can ignore this great salvation that was first announced to us through our Lord Jesus himself and delivered by those who spake of him? You see, the entire Bible from the beginning to the end points us towards Jesus. It points us towards salvation. It points us towards hope. One of the miners said that while he was in the cave, he saw God. When he was in the cave, he saw the devil. But the choice he made today, that day, was God. I have a small clip that I want to show in closing.
This is all the food we have left to keep us alive. We have to ration it carefully. If we plan on surviving down here until we are rescued.
Rescued?